Thanks again for listening to the Hour of History podcast. Our producer, James Auble, has been doing some great things with the website. You can check out at hourofhistory.com. We've got a new design, new links, and all the great content we've recorded in the past. It's available for you, free, whenever you want, at hourofhistory.com. Check it out, and be sure to leave us comments and suggestions. We love to hear from you. Hello, welcome. Good to have you with us on the Hour of History podcast. Wherever you are, today we will focus on one city and one single day, how it revealed the history and foreshadowed the future of one of the world's most important places. The time is November 12th, 1941, and while the world is at war, Shanghai is an international, cosmopolitan, crowded celebration of place. There's multiple events going on that give us insight to the fantastic rise of this formidable city that's about to face the realities of war. I'm talking with Dr. James Carter, who's just written the book Champion's Day, The End of Old Shanghai. Dr. Carter has written 2 previous books on China. He's a professor at St. Joseph's University in Philadelphia and a fellow on the National Committee of U.S.-China Relations. Our fascinating conversation takes you back and forth from the origins of this Shanghai international settlement to looking into the future about one of the world's most fantastic cities. So sit back, relax, and listen to this fascinating talk about a compelling topic in a time where our minds might be elsewhere. It wasn't too different from how people were thinking in 1941. Thanks for listening. As always, there's more content at hourofhistory.com. On the Hour of History podcast, it's our world, anytime, any place. Enjoy. So here I am with Dr. James Carter. He's on the Hour of History podcast. Hello, and how are you doing, James?
I'm doing well. I was with everybody making the best of our pandemic situation, but I'm doing well.
Yeah, it's a strange time. Obviously, that's been said a million times, but it's great to have these moments of happiness where you see a beautiful new book like yours, Champion's Day, The End of Old Shanghai. Tell us a little bit about yourself and perhaps how you came to Shanghai.
Sure. Well, when I started graduate school, which was a long while ago now, but I wound up focusing on a language program. I'd come into graduate school to study Chinese history, but my Chinese was not nearly at the place that it needed to be. So I was getting ready to go do a language program in the city of Harbin, up in Manchuria, in northeast China. And it turned out that the director of the YMCA in Harbin was an American, and he had retired to Connecticut and left his papers to the Yale University library, which is where I was doing my PhD. And so I went there and encountered this whole world of a mix of China and Europe and Russia and the United States, and they were all mashed together, and started a career path that was really going to lead me towards studying the relation between China and the West, and that was something that just presented endless possibilities. And so my first book was looking at the city of Harbin. I did a second book which followed a Buddhist monk around to various cities like Qingdao, where the beer is from, and Hong Kong, and also Harbin, and other cities with this kind of joint history of China and the West. And then eventually that led me to a place with a little milder weather than Manchuria, but led me to Shanghai. And so I really wanted to find a story that was going to enable me to spend some time researching and studying and writing about Shanghai. And that's eventually what led me to Champion's Day.
Wow, that's fantastic. Before we get too far into Champion's Day, I just have to stop you there because I think it's great. There's a lot there that's really fantastic. First of all, I mean, going into this PhD and wanting to study a topic and having the opportunity to go then study the language, I think that's awesome. And I hope a lot of people can do that. But second, I too have a little experience in China, and maybe you can share a little bit about the actual coldness about Harbin. I once stayed at a hostel in Harbin that was actually a former Jewish synagogue. It's a fascinating place, and what a perfect place to learn the language.
It is, and it's okay. So about the cold, it is cold. Now, the winter that I was there, my advisors and my friends who were there, when I left, and I arrived there in September, and I left in February, and my friends who were there said this was a really mild winter, and their definition of a mild winter is that it never got to -40. And it came close, but never did. The other thing that I learned, as maybe you learned as well, is that -40 is the place where Fahrenheit and Celsius come together. So if you saw the weather forecast and you knew that the closer it got to -40 Celsius, that you didn't have to convert it anymore, because it eventually would get to the same on both temperature scales, which is to say really, really cold. But the weather there is just a fact of life. And I wound up preparing myself for it. The weather outside was not so much of a problem as the weather inside, to be honest. So my dormitory, et cetera, was nice and toasty warm, but the library, this was in the mid 90s, and China was going through this transition with the state-owned enterprises into a more kind of a free market economy, and a lot of the public sector was really struggling with that. So the library where I was doing my research wasn't very well heated. And so I remember one weekend, they were closed on the weekend. So I would come back in on a Monday morning, and I had left my cup that it had tea in it on Friday afternoon, and I had forgotten it on my desk. And I came back in, and it was sitting in the same place where it had been sitting on Friday. But on Monday morning, there was a skim of ice across the top of it. So that was my encounter of the cold of Manchuria. Not so much the -30 degrees outside, but when it was getting around freezing inside, that gets a little extreme.
And like you said, Manchuria is a place where you can't avoid these intermingling of cultural backgrounds, cultural exchanges, deep history of different groups of people.
Absolutely. And that was part of what attracted me to it. And eventually that's what led me to kind of focus somewhere else, because it's so complicated to do it well. So I was using a lot of sources in English. I was using a lot of sources in Chinese. I was using a lot of sources in French. And then I had to learn some Russian in order to deal with what the topic I was writing about then. And I'd learned Japanese before I did any of those things, just kind of by happenstance. But I really wasn't at the place where I felt that I could maintain all those languages at the level I needed to and hold down a kind of an undergraduate teaching position. And so I needed to transition to a place where I was still going to have to deal with a lot of challenging linguistic situations, but I didn't think that I could do justice to just how complex Manchuria or Dongbei, the northeastern China, was. So eventually I migrated to places that were, no less diverse, but where I could focus a little bit narrower on just maybe 2 or 3 languages instead of 5 or 6.
and it is extraordinary the depth of knowledge now in a field that was for a long time relatively underdeveloped, but now we have historians who are working on these individual cities precisely because they are so complex just as units of themselves. Maybe this can get us into Champions Day and Shanghai a little bit. What is this place that you're studying? People are familiar maybe with this massive city, but not its historical background.
So sure. I mean, Shanghai is, so now I think people tend to be very familiar with Shanghai as the largest city in China, or depending on how you count, one of the very largest cities in China. And, the most well-known city, perhaps outside of China, people are going to know, if they know any place in China, they're going to know Shanghai. And so I think a lot of times people associate that knowledge and that familiarity with an idea that Shanghai must be very ancient. Like they hear a lot about China, and there's this kind of cliche about 5,000 years of history, and that's a whole nother podcast. But the idea that Shanghai is a really famous Chinese city, so it must have a really, really long history. And it does have a long history, but not in the same kind of form and prominence that it is now. So Shanghai, up until the middle of the 19th century, was a port. It's sometimes said it was just a small fishing village, and that's not really accurate. It was a regional port. It was a regional port at the mouth of the Yangtze River, and that ultimately becomes a crucial factor in its development. But it really springs onto the international scene starting in the middle of the 19th century, when, as a result of the Treaty of Nanjing ending the First Opium War, it, along with five other cities, becomes open to trade on British and European terms. And so, starting in the middle of the 1800s, it grows a large foreign community. And that foreign community is dominated, especially at the outset, by British residents, British migrants, who come and establish residence there, and really build it's never technically a colony, but it is. It acts like a colony. It looks like a colony. It smells like a colony. It behaves in every way like a colony, except technically, it remains Chinese sovereign territory. But it's administered from about 1843 until about 1943. It's technically administered by foreigners at its center, and that's the world that Champions Day comes to tell the story of, really the end of. But how in 1941 that this represents, just as the Japanese are going to invade what's left of Shanghai, the parts of Shanghai they haven't occupied yet, they're going to come to occupy that in December of 1941 as part of the offensive that included Pearl Harbor, that'll be familiar to Americans, and that's that offensive also brings an end to the British and the American domination of the center of Shanghai.
And so that's like a fantastic background. It's good to have the context, and having taught high school in New York City, students had to learn the term for the test, Treaty of Nanjing, and it was always like, oh, why do we have to learn this thing? But you've brought it right back to the present, and you've at least the 1940s, the present of your book, and you see why it's so important to understand these terms maybe a century before. And that's what's really neat about your book, because although it focuses on this event set in one day, 1 year, it's a much larger story of China. Within this non-colony international settlement, it sounds like it would be a great place for the growth of internationalism. How is it that these internationals are brought together? What sort of events and things bring them together?
Well, Shanghai, it's controversial, and that's one thing that I try to deal with head on in Champions Day. Is there's a sense of nostalgia in Shanghai for old Shanghai, and a lot of that is built. I mean, if you've been in Shanghai, you'll see these, not only the grand new buildings that are among the tallest in the world on one side of the Huangpu River, but on the other side, you'll see these skyscrapers of their day, these sort of Art Deco, mix of Art Deco and other architectural designs on the Bund, which is the row of foreign design, mostly foreign designed and built structures dating from the 1890s through about the 1930s. And so that's this scene. Like, if you've seen the second Indiana Jones movie, for instance, it starts in old Shanghai, and this kind of romanticized Orientalist mixture that is often presented through these kind of rose-colored glasses, and that it's something that it was glamorous, and it was fancy, and it was all sorts of international cosmopolitan elements brought together, and there's a kind of a nostalgia for that. At the same time, it was it's an intensely racist place. It was a segregated society for most of that 100 years. The dominant population was always Chinese. Even in the international settlement, well over 90% of the population was Chinese. Most of the Chinese who were living there were not living glamorous lives. They were living lives that were, they were colonized, and that was something that you need to kind of recognize and be very careful romanticizing what went on in the Shanghai of that day. That part of the story, which has been emphasized especially by the Communist Party in the 50s and the 60s and the 70s, really emphasizing the evils of imperialism, that's a really important part of the story too. But that too is imperfect, as any partial history is. So the nostalgia and the romanticization, that's not a good full picture, and neither is the kind of demonization of that era. And I think a fuller picture gives you something that includes not only Western elites, and not just elites, Westerners of various classes and various nationalities coming together, but also with a Chinese elite. And Chinese, remember, Shanghai is growing rapidly, so it's bringing in migrants from all over the world, but it's especially bringing in migrants from all over China. So people are coming to China to make a fortune, or maybe they're just coming to China to Shanghai to make a living. And you wind up with this, I think you said this international or cosmopolitan class of people that includes men and women who are coming from the United States. They're coming from England, they're coming from Scotland, they're coming from Japan, they're coming from Baghdad via India. They're coming especially, though, from all over China. And these people all meet together, and a lot of them meet at the racetrack. And the Shanghai Race Club is built almost as soon as International Shanghai comes to be. It's founded in 1850. And throughout its history, it never permitted Chinese to join. So, I mean, that's when I talk about the segregation and the racism of the society, like that's baked in. But by the time you get to the last few decades of old Shanghai, so the 1920s and 30s and 40s, you have, in effect, membership, de facto membership, because there are other racetracks that are built in Shanghai that are built by Chinese, and they enjoy reciprocal privileges with the Shanghai Race Club. So it's a way, and it's astonishing just how important kind of racism can be to the people who are practicing it. So they wanted to be able to tell themselves that they maintain this whites only kind of refuge at the center of the city. However, there were a lot of people there who weren't white. There were a lot of people there who were Chinese, a lot of people who were Japanese, a lot of people who would come from different countries around the world. They were able to be in the clubhouse, and they were participating, and they were sitting side by side with the folks at the race club, but they weren't able to be quote unquote members, which is important. But it also, if you take either side of that, if you take the idea that they were segregated, or you take the idea that this was a whites-only community, it kind of belies the idea that there was a lot more mixing and a lot more cross-pollination. That is something we really need to keep in mind if we're going to get a fuller picture of what Shanghai was in the 1920s, 30s, 40s.
I mean, there's a lot there. One of the important things that you mentioned that we should highlight is truly the level of diversity in China, and the way that this continues to morph, because you have intermarriages and people who are, or actually not intermarriages technically, because a lot of them don't end up getting married, but a whole different class as well of people who are Eurasian. Are those people allowed in the club?
Yeah, well, it depends. So one of the people who is at the center of the story, and she's at the center of the story in an unusual way, is a woman named Luo Jialing, or Liza Hardoon. And Liza Hardoon so her father was French, her mother was Chinese, but she was raised as Chinese. And then when she is a young woman, she marries Silas Hardoon, who is he's a Jewish businessman who comes to Shanghai he's from Baghdad. He comes via India and Hong Kong, arrives in Shanghai, and makes his fortune in real estate and opium. But they marry, and they have this really remarkable multicultural center that becomes Hardoon Gardens. And it's a combination of Jewish and Buddhist and Chinese and European and Middle Eastern and Indian and all these different elements coming together right there in the center of Shanghai. And Liza Hardoon, so her husband, Silas Hardoon, he was a member at the race club. So to answer that question, no, Liza Hardoon could have accompanied him as his wife and as a guest. But she would not have been able to join the club, probably. It's a lot of these things are left unstated and vague. There was never a formal. I've looked through the guidebooks and the rules, the rule books to the club, and there was never a formal rule excluding Chinese from being members. But there were standards about someone had to be of the right qualifications for membership, and those were never articulated, which was partly intentional, so that you could kind of manipulate them in the ways that you wanted. There was a fair amount of anti-Semitism in Shanghai as well, but that could be ignored if someone were of the prominence and the wealth of someone like Silas Hardoon or the Sassoons, who are another very prominent Jewish family in Shanghai. They were also members of the race club. So you had again, these Eurasian, a lot of the other members of the Shanghai Landers, which are these largely British expatriates who are living in Shanghai and making Shanghai their home, but a lot of them were of mixed parentage. So a lot of the people who we think of as being quintessentially Shanghailanders had Chinese parents or grandparents, and that, depending on the specific circumstances in which they grew up, they might be presented as English, and they happen to have a Chinese grandparent, or they might really think of themselves as Eurasian. And some of the most important people, like the Cumines, who were another family that's prominent at the racetrack, but they were very Eurasian in their background and their upbringing. Eric Cumine grew up speaking multiple languages, including English and including one or more Chinese dialects.
And so these cosmopolitan families that have a lot of backgrounds find a home in the race club. Certainly the perception we have of horse racing here today in the U.S. is one of great wealth and thoroughly bred horses that are quite big. But what's the situation with the animals there?
Yeah, both in terms of horse racing in the 1930s and 40s, very, very different than horse racing today. And horse racing in Shanghai would have been very different from what you would have seen going on in New York or Paris or London or Louisville, Kentucky. So and you mentioned about the horses themselves. Yeah, these were ponies, and they were officially China ponies. And these China ponies were, if you may have seen pictures of they're called Przewalski horses. There are a few in zoos around the world. There are some in the Bronx Zoo. The Prague Zoo in Europe has a bunch of them. They were one of the main breeders, but they're just like little horses, and they kind of have they're considered to be related to these China ponies. So China ponies were short. So for instance, when the owners would walk their horses or their ponies into the winner's circle, oftentimes the owner would stand taller than the horse, which is not something that you would see with a thoroughbred horse today. They're very shaggy. They're very furry. They have these enormous heads and broad shoulders and big tails. And so they looked kind of silly to read some of the accounts, but the spectators in China came to really admire them, and they considered that they had a stamina and a competitive spirit, and something that made them, as they often said, like the mark of a true racehorse were these China ponies. So they weren't elegant, weren't beautiful, but they were remarkable animals. And then in terms of the races themselves, it's important to keep in mind that in the 1930s and 40s, horse racing was the most popular spectator sport in the world. And so you would see this not just as a very elite occupation, although certainly the owners of horses tended to be wealthy, but the people who would go to the track were not wealthy. A lot of times they would go to gamble, or sometimes they would just go to be entertained. But if you think about the cross section of the racetrack and the day that I write about on Champions Day of November 1941. They were, depending on the estimate, 20 to 40,000 people at the racetrack. You don't know exactly what that number is, but we can be confident that maybe 75, 80, perhaps more percent of the crowd was Chinese, and from a variety of social classes. I have pictures and films of the grandstands, and that's something that's important to keep in mind. So it's, when we think of horse racing, we often think of it now, maybe especially in an English context, of these very fancy hats and these very elaborate get-ups and wealthy people celebrating their conspicuous consumption. But horse racing in the 1940s and 30s wasn't quite that. And in Shanghai, certainly there were people who treated it that way, but for a lot of people, it was daily kind of entertainment.
And Jay, one of the great things about your book is all of those images and documents that we actually get to see as a reader. Can you, where did you get those from? Where did you find these images?
So actually, that's a peek ahead to one of my recommendations, which I'll get to when we're there. Well, I mean, it was funny. So as I mentioned to you in our pre-conversation, I just literally got the physical copies of the book yesterday, and so as I was doing that and I was kind of sharing that exciting news, I was going back through a lot of my own records, and I went back to the first day that I went to kind of explore this concept of the idea of writing this one day set at the racetrack. And the place to do it, where I started looking, was a place called Jia Wei or Wei, which is a branch library of the Shanghai Municipal Library. and it's out now in the western suburbs of the city. But it used to be kind of a separate village that was near Shanghai, but not really in Shanghai. And the Jesuits had established a whole complex there. There was an orphanage, there was a library, there was a cathedral, there was a residence, there were a whole bunch of different structures that were part of this Jesuit compound. And the library there remains really the core of this collection, which is, if I remember how it's put, it's the largest collection of non-Chinese language materials on China in China. So what that means for a place like Shanghai, where you had, it's very hard to imagine just how cosmopolitan a place like Shanghai was in the 19th century. So you had newspapers published in literally dozens of languages. So if you go now to the Jia Wei Library, you can find materials that are written in certainly in English, but also in Russian and in French and in German. And going there is where I was able to get a hold of a lot of these newspapers for the first time. Now, many of them are available digitally around the world, although a lot of those are incomplete, and I was still finding copies of things that I would expect I would be able to get someplace else, but in fact, they were uniquely available there in Jia Wei. And so it really was going in there, and I was able to go through and read things like the North China Herald and the Shanghai Times and the China Press and these different newspapers that were just reporting on the races. And, I had a background when I was in college. I worked as a sports editor and a sports writer for the college paper. And so I never really kind of lost that love of sports writing, and just maybe something I miss, especially today, is not being able to watch sports on TV or in person in COVID-19 times. But so that was something I really enjoyed, is just reading through the sports pages. And as I would do that, I would connect them with the other events going on at the same time. And so those images, a lot of them are just presented in the newspapers of the time. And it really is, a picture's worth 1,000 words is a cliche of cliches, but it really is remarkable how reading all of this stuff and then just seeing an image which showed you what these crowds were like. Because I could read the paper and it would sound like that this was a sport that I might associate with a lot of pretty wealthy white people going to watch their horses run. But then I would look at the picture and I would see that, in fact, this was a group that was not mostly wealthy. It was not mostly white. It was mostly male, but not entirely male. There were quite a few women who would go to the races as well. And so it was a mix of Shanghai. And it's not to say that it was typical. That's not to say that that a slice of the racetrack gave you a slice of like the average Shanghai resident. But it is the case that the racetrack gave you a big, diverse portrait of what a lot of people in Shanghai were doing on those race day afternoons.
Yeah, and as we're in this strange time where it seems like COVID is taking so much of our mental capacity, it's interesting studying this period around where it seems the world is falling apart. Now, in my own research, I'm combing through newspapers looking at what's happening in Havana. And like you said, on one page, it'll say Hitler invades Poland. And on the next page, it'll say Florida Gators visiting University of Havana for football match. So this is 1941. I mean, a lot is happening. How is horse racing still going on?
That's in some ways, that's the question that I think I'm hoping will kind of draw in some readers to the book, which is to be like, this doesn't make any sense. So a little bit more background in terms of where Shanghai is in the fall of 1941. So as I mentioned earlier, Shanghai has this colony at its core. It actually has two colonies at its core, although they're not officially colonies. So one is the International Settlement, which is administered by British and American primarily interests. And then there's the French concession. The French concession is run a little bit more technically as a colony, but it's administered by the French. And those two areas are at the core. It's a small area. It's a small area. If you think of it just as like the downtown core of almost any big city, that's sort of what you're looking at in terms of the French concession and the International Settlement. All the rest of Shanghai is invaded and occupied by the Japanese in 1937. So starting in 1937, that center of Shanghai is something that is an area that's called the Lone Island, or the Lonely Island, the Gudao. And that period is seen as this, Shanghai is something very, very unique. So it's neutral, whereas it's 1937. So from 1937, 38 into 1939, there's no war in Europe. And so the Europeans are not engaged in the war at all. And then even after 1939, the Americans aren't involved in the war, and the British aren't involved in the war with the Japanese. So they're seeing this as this kind of island of neutrality in the center of the city, even though it's completely surrounded by war. So everybody is, and the metaphor I sometimes use is kind of like Wile E. Coyote, that they've kind of gone off the edge of the cliff, but they haven't looked down yet and don't realize that they're about to plummet to their doom. And that's really what's going on in Shanghai during those years, 37, 38, 39, 40 into 41, is that Shanghai it's in an impossible situation, but the longer it goes on, the more people who are in it start to think that, well, maybe it is sustainable. Maybe we could keep doing this. And so there's scarcity, and there's rationing, and there's occasional riots and runs on banks and food banks and inflation and all these kinds of things you read about in the paper. But then you flip the page and it's talking about the races. And it is this image of really fiddling while Shanghai burns. But it is something that's just simply remarkable. The extent to which people are trying to, I mean, you can spin it in a couple different ways. You can say they're trying to get on with their lives because they can, which is on the one hand admirable because people are trying to go on with their lives, and on the other hand, it's reprehensible. I mean, you look at the suffering that's going on in China, and we talk about the rape of Nanking, the Nanking massacre. That's happening in the winter of 1937, and Shanghai and Nanjing are only a couple hundred miles apart. And it's very, very close, and they're reading about it in the Shanghai papers. So it is this. I try to present it as something that I don't want to glorify, and I don't want to just call out as being an oddity. I want it to be a lens to let us see, like, this is what these people are doing at this particular moment. What does that tell us about the world that they were coming from, that they're kind of trying desperately to cling to? And yet, what are the signs all around them, and what can we see that's foreshadowing the world that's going to envelop them in? Little did they know in November of 1941, in just another couple of weeks, it was going to come to an end.
And for a long time, these actual boundaries really matter. You describe this architectural city that's imagined, this Art Deco wonderland. Dong Dayo does it. And it's it's not in the international settlement, so it's susceptible to this outside war.
Yeah, so the day that I write about, November 12th, 1941, and there's kind of three different events going on that I use to structure the book. So one is this last Champions Day. So the Champions Day refers to the day on which they hold the Champions Stakes, and that's meant to be a race among all the winning horses of that fall's meeting. And so it's a holiday in the international settlement. Most of the businesses and banks close. People come and they spend the day at the races. But there's two other events that are going on that same day, just by coincidence. One, I mentioned Liza Hardoon earlier. So she's at the center of the action, not because she's at the racetrack, but because she's passed away. She died about a month earlier, but her funeral is held on November 12th, 1941. It's an international event, too. There's reporters from all around the world. The LA Times sends reporters and photographers to cover this funeral that's going on the other side of the world. So that is another event that draws about maybe 5,000 people are estimated to have been at her funeral. There's, as I said, 30,000 probably at the racetrack. And then there's a third event. And that third event is, as you mentioned, Dong Dayo, or Dayu Dun, as he called himself in English. So he was an architect. He'd been educated in Rome and then at the University of Minnesota, although he was from China. He went back to Shanghai to work as an architect and designed what's meant to be the capital of the new Shanghai. So there are even discussions not too long before the Japanese invasion about ending this international settlement and establishing a new Shanghai that would be truly a Chinese city. And as part of the planning for that, they design and build a new city center. And this new city center is a few miles north of the international settlement, and it's still there. It's not too far from like Fudan University, one of China's most important universities is in that area. And it is designed to be a modernist a modern and modernist capital. And so it has these Art Deco gems. One of the most entertaining ones is they designed the they designed the different museums, and they designed different libraries and a stadium. The stadium was going to be able to host all these different events, all with an Art Deco style. But then there's, in addition, trying to make it into a Chinese place, because they wanted it to be something distinct from the international, more Western-looking buildings that were there on the Bund. So, for instance, the Mayor's Building, which is in the background to a lot of the events that take place in the international settlement, is built with kind of a traditional Chinese-style roof with like the half-hipped, half-gabled eaves. So that's in the international. That's in this new municipal center, and as you say, it's outside the boundaries of the international settlement. So it's built during the 1930s, but as you say, because it's outside those boundaries, it's invaded by the Japanese. So it's taken over in 1937 and becomes the host of a collaborationist government, which is collaborating with the Japanese as a means of bringing an end to the war and bringing China into part of Japan's orbit. And November the 12th happens to be the birthday of Sun Yat-sen. So Sun Yat-sen had been the founder of the Republic of China a few decades earlier. He had passed away in 1925, but celebrating him as the father of the nation was something that had been a regular ritual in the Republic of China. And it's a very strange moment because this collaborationist regime starts celebrating the birthday of Sun Yat-sen as a means of sort of promoting their own patriotism and demonstrating the fact that actually we are truly the people who are looking after the legacy of the Chinese Revolution, even though they're collaborating with the Japanese against the government that was itself the successor of Sun Yat-sen. So those celebrations are going on also on November 12th. So you have these three different nodes, one at the racetrack, which is the largest, second, which is Liza Hardin's funeral, which represents this kind of an end of an era of this generation of folks who had made their fortunes in Shanghai. And then the third would be the celebration of Sun Yat-sen's birthday a few miles away at this kind of Art Deco city center that was to represent the new Shanghai.
And you can see how tangled these stories and these timelines get. I thought one of the most useful things you did, there was a great section that was just describing the flags as a great tool to untangle this mess, and that's something for the readers to find in the book. But I just wanted to say I appreciated that. So we have all these different people and groups and cosmopolitans, people hanging on to the internationalism, an advance of the Japanese nationalism, and it meets in these spaces. And then especially the racetrack. I mean, it's right on the cover. We have all these different. I mean, we could do a whole study of just what people are wearing. When does the tension bubble over?
Which tension? There's so many tensions to talk about. Which tension did you have in mind?
When does the tension of this survival of Shanghai land, this lonely island of peace existing, end?
Yeah. Well, so. I have to admit, like with many things, and I mean, history is always written. We write history from the present, but at the moment, of course, there's not a narrative arc that people are living in. Those things come later. So I talk about Champions Day and November 12th, of 1941 as being the last Champions Day. Well, that's only kind of true. So November 12th, 1941 is the last Champions Day that's where the Shanghai Race Club is run sort of as it had been. So even though the international settlement is surrounded by Japanese armies, the international settlement itself is still administered by British and American interests for the most part. A couple of weeks later, December 8th, 1941, is when the Japanese armies come into the international settlement and they take over. They take over all of this, but their initial plan is to try to let the settlement go on as it had been, partly with the idea of letting these Western and clearly imperialist powers have the notion that if Japan takes over as the new imperial power, that they're going to be able to operate kind of as they had before. So trying to give the impression that it wouldn't be worth it to fight a war against Japan because, in fact, Japan's going to bring order, it's going to bring stability, and all these things are going to continue more or less as they were before, except the Japanese would be maintaining order, and they're hoping that they can pass this off. And so the Shanghai Race Club continues to operate. It's closed for a couple of weeks, but it opens up again in late December of 1941. And there is another Champions Day in the spring of 1942, which is run under the auspices of the Shanghai Race Club, but with the Japanese still in charge. And that's a very kind of strange and very liminal moment when you're seeing how so many things, again, are present that had been there before, but they're in this completely new context. And now it's not as though it's a lonely island of isolation anymore. It's now really in the midst of the war, and all this stuff is swirling about, and just people have not really had a chance to make sense of it. And then the Japanese claim that they're going to have another Champions Day in the fall of 1942. But then a few weeks before that happens, most of the principals who are involved in the race club are arrested and interned, sent to internment camps, which is where most of the enemy combatants spend the rest of the war. That's not the case for all the people who were involved in my story. So, for instance, Cornell Franklin, who's an American who had been the president of the head of the Shanghai Municipal Council, he goes back home on a repatriation vessel. So does Arthur Henchman, who had been the manager of HSBC, the bank. He goes back to England also on a repatriation vessel in 1942. So a lot of these people who had been involved prior to the Japanese invasion wind up spending most of the war at home. They get out, but for many of the British nationals and other allied nations, they spend the war in an internment camp in and around Shanghai. But even that's not the end of the story, because the races continue to run all through World War II. They're controlled by the Japanese, and most of the owners and riders at this point are either Japanese or Chinese who are collaborating with the Japanese, or they're from Axis-powered or neutral nations. So there are some Portuguese and some Norwegians and some people who are in different riding and representing different countries, and they're able to continue these races. And the last advertisement I found in a Chinese newspaper for the races was in August of 1945. So just a couple of weeks before the atomic bomb drops on Pearl Harbor. And even that's not the end, because then when World War II comes to a close, Cornell Franklin, the American, he goes back to Shanghai with the idea that he's going to revive the racetrack, and he negotiates with the Chinese government to try and reopen the track. And it's clear it's not going to work, because by this point the racetrack is now a symbol of imperialism, and it's no longer representing kind of a cosmopolitanism that is seen as a positive thing. And in addition, the kind of underpinning of this whole system had been a system known as extraterritoriality, which enabled foreigners in China to be living under their own laws, not under Chinese laws. That's something that had come in the middle of the 19th century. So that system is done away with during World War II. And so to come back into China and reestablish a racetrack that Cornell Franklin was hoping to do, but without the kind of the twin elements of the racetrack itself, which would have to be revived and rebuilt and repaired, but also the extraterritoriality that had given this kind of semi-colonial system in Shanghai. With both those things gone, it was never really going to come to fruition. And then, in case there was any questions about that, when the Communist Revolution overtakes Shanghai in 1949, that really puts an end to it. And Cornell Franklin is in Shanghai when the communists take over. He stays in Shanghai until 1950, when he finally leaves, comes back to the United States. So perhaps unsurprisingly, for something that had been in place for so long, it does not end abruptly, but it ends in kind of fits and starts. Starting, I'm going to say the beginning of that end is probably in 1937. And it's really not until 1950 that it's ultimately ultimately over. But I take 1941, in November of 1941, as being that last moment when it really was something that looked a lot like it had been for the previous century.
And there's very rich recountings of not just the end of Cornell Franklin's life, and not just Cornell Franklin, but quite a few people. And I found those some of the most rewarding parts of the book is just these wild stories from, the University of Mississippi through Hawaii, then to Shanghai. And there's a lot of that in the book that I think people will find valuable. One of the other things that you mention is how it kind of these things don't just go away, and you do have a bit of the modern in your book as well. I wish I had known this history when I had gone to Shanghai, because I didn't know I was walking over what was the racetrack. How might someone walk differently in Shanghai after reading your book? What can you still see?
Well, this is a little bit heartbreaking. I mean, it's not nearly a tragedy, especially given how much suffering is going on in the world today.
Right.
But one thing that I was hoping to be doing right now was I would be in China right now. We're recording this in May, and in 2 weeks, a little less than 2 weeks, I was going to be at the old race club doing a launch event for this book. So actually, the Shanghai Race Club building, the clubhouse, it was made into an art museum. It was made into a library. It was made into a museum again. There was a fancy restaurant up on the top. And finally, last year, I guess actually, technically in 2018, but it became the Shanghai History Museum. So now if you go to the center of Shanghai, the place where all of the many of the different metro lines come together, and sort of the municipal center of the city is People's Square and People's Park, which are next to one another. And that's where the old racetrack used to be. And if you look at it from above, you'll see that it's an oval shape. And this oval shaped green space at the center of the city, that was indeed where the racetrack was. And what's still there is the race club, the clubhouse, which is now this museum. And so you can climb up to the roof of the museum, and you can look out over where the racetrack had been. It's now a park. I mean, you can't tell it was a racetrack, but if you know that it used to be a race course, you can make out the outlines of the track. You can see where it would have been, and it does stand out in Shanghai because Shanghai is so densely built, except for this park there in the center, and so it really does stand out. And the clubhouse itself is this monument to an era that is on, and it produces some really remarkable emotions, I think, because not only does it have a sense of history connected to it, some of it good, some of it bad, but also it used to be such a prominent landmark. So the clock tower with this bizarre architectural style, which, has probably more in common with like Cheesecake Factory than a lot of the sort of prominent monuments that we might like to think of. But that clock tower used to be the tallest building around, or then later on it wasn't the tallest building around, but it certainly stood out as being a landmark. And now it's just completely dwarfed by these skyscrapers that are many, many, many times taller than it is. So sometimes it's almost become a cliche to say that when you go to Shanghai, if you go to the riverfront, you look to one side and you see the Bund, which are these old Western style buildings, which were monuments and skyscrapers in their day, but then you go to the other side where they're completely overshadowed by these new Chinese skyscrapers that are among the tallest in the world. And they say it's a symbol between West and East in the past and the future. But certainly when you're at the Shanghai, what used to be the Shanghai Race Club, you certainly get a sense of this used to be a center of a world, and that world has now been completely replaced by a new one that's all around it.
A complete replacement. Would you say this? Well, no, we better not get into it. I was going to bring into the discussion a little bit about the century of dishonor and maybe changing opinions. But obviously, things have changed so much in the last few months. What is your sort of outlook for Shanghai in terms of internationalism, in terms of its global importance, that kind of thing?
Yeah, I mean, I closed the book by trying to call back to this fortune teller who wrote in 1941 about how, if there's ever a time when we needed a glimpse into the future, it's now. And she was saying this in 1941. I might say in 2020 we could probably use it just as badly. It's really hard to say. I mean, I've been very optimistic about the future of China's relations with the West and with America's relations to China. And I have to say that optimism is pretty shaken right now. I think on both sides of the equation. I don't think I don't think either side is behaving in a way that can make me optimistic. And right now, I'm just very discouraged because just the fact of the difficulty of travel because of disease and because of pandemic is one thing. But in addition, trade, actual trade war and threat of further trade war and just, violence against foreigners in the United States, anti-Chinese sentiment and racist sentiment toward East Asians, but also in China, the idea of anti-American sentiment, which I think both sides play a role in. So I do think that Shanghai in particular has prospered most when it's looked outward. And I think that the hope until very recently, and maybe in a couple of years I'll feel better about this, but I think the hope is that Shanghai could return to a time when it really was an international city, this time an international city that's governed and run by Chinese and not by foreigners abroad, but a place that was nonetheless welcoming of international ideas and international goods and international currents. I think that's the kind of city that Shanghai is at its best and can be at its core. But right now, I can't really say that I'm encouraged about its prospects at least in the near future.
Yeah, it is a sad note, especially for people who, have been to China and know this right away, just what an extraordinary place it can be, and you would wish others can go experience that. So you have a unique challenge with this book being released in June of 2020. You had, what would have been an extraordinary presentation at the race club that can't happen because of travel restrictions. How are you adjusting to this process?
There's been an enormous outpouring of creativity and energy and goodwill by a lot of folks who are involved in the publishing industry and just around authors, and I'd include you in that group of people who are enabling authors to reach an audience. So one of them that's coming up. So, for instance, I'm doing a bunch of virtual book talks, some public library in my hometown, and the National Committee on U.S.-China Relations in New York City. But also, there's a group called Historic Shanghai that I've worked with for a number of years, and they're going to host an event in July. So it's going to be a walking tour. So they're going to do a walking tour to many of the different sites in Shanghai that are important in the book, and then we're going to come back together. I'll be in the United States, but I will then join them for discussion of the book and of their walk and things like that. But otherwise, it's kind of every day a new opportunity presents itself, because a lot of this is new for the first time. So whereas it used to be a very straightforward idea that you would try to place some features or some op-eds, and you would try to do some book events at maybe some bookstores or some historical societies or things like that. Now it's much harder to get a lot of those things together because you can't go and you don't, you can't have the physical interaction, which is so important to spreading the word about anything. At the same time, I can go to an event in Colorado or Seattle or Texas or Florida, which I couldn't necessarily do before, but I can do it virtually. So it's not to say that it's just as good. It's not, but there are certainly opportunities as well as costs.
Yeah, absolutely. And my hope is that it does go to a broader audience, and people will be looking for these kind of things that can take them out of the place that they're currently in, I would hope. There's this old sort of trope that the academic historian goes and writes a couple books, and then you write for wider audiences. You've written 3 books on very different topics, but kind of under the same umbrella. Where does one go from here?
That's a good question. It's one I've been thinking about a lot lately, and I'm not really sure. I've got a couple of different ideas that have to do. They're all about Chinese history, and that's what I do, and all of them touch on the interaction between China and the West. That's the way I've kind of tried to characterize my career, although I didn't start out that way. I kind of looked back at it a few years later and saw that what I really was doing was writing about China's relations with the West, but not doing it kind of from a diplomatic or state-to-state lens, but doing it from a person-to-person, more of an individual level. And I'm going to do something to do with that next. And I'm figuring that this summer is going to be largely about figuring out exactly what direction that's going to be.
Yeah, I apologize. That's a brutal question that all authors are faced with when they complete this great work, and people say, "Well, what's next?"
But it's important. But it's important because in some ways something comes out, and I've been working on this for a number of years. So I'm like, at the time, I really need to be talking about this and kind of celebrating what I've accomplished. I also need to be moving on to something else because it's time.
Exactly, and you never know what idea will pop into your head. Unfortunately, it's getting to be time for us, but fortunately, we're getting to the recommendations. So to our audience is all over the place. They're in Australia, they're in India, China, the United States, Canada. What would you suggest?
Well, I would make two suggestions, and one is a more academic one, and the other is not. So the more academic one is so you asked earlier about images, and if anybody wants to explore not just old Shanghai but China, if you go to the University of Bristol, they have a website. It's called Historical Photographs of China, HPC, and these historical photographs of China that's housed at the University of Bristol just is collected photographs from all over the world and made many of them available online. They're making more of them available digitally all the time. And the staff there, led by Jamie Carstairs and Robert Bickers, they are just to do a tremendous service for the field and pull things together. And even just going in there and looking around is an opportunity to kind of get lost in China's past. Obviously, because they're photographs, they're they only go back so far. But if you're looking anywhere from the link up to that, and then that free time is not finishing up the book or finishing up grading, doing all the other things. COVID-19 is watching movies, but one movie that I'm certainly not alone in recommending, but is Train to Busan. Which if you haven't seen it, it may not be the best thing for everybody to watch in the midst of a pandemic because any spoilers, there's an apocalyptic quality to it. But it's really, really excellent. And I would, South Korean film is doing, Paris got a huge amount of attention, deservedly so, in my opinion. But there's a ton of South Korean films out there that are really excellent. And Train to Busan, Busan, is one that I recommend highly, especially if you're a fan of the apocalypse sci-fi zombie genre. So if you're not into that, we'll find another recommendation another time.
Those are great recommendations. I had a recommendation. I'll do two of them on film as well. One of them is more closely tied to my work and refugees, but it gives you some great video images and interviews with the Jewish refugees who went through Shanghai. It's called Shanghai Ghetto, and it came out in 2002. And a lot of these people who are interviewed actually have passed on now. These are survivors and the children of survivors. But there is some fascinating archival footage of the international settlement where some of these refugees came to be. And then the second recommendation, I'll do a Korean film too, because I just watched it. I'd seen it before, but Snowpiercer, great.
Yes.
Yeah.
I endorse both of those recommendations.
Awesome. Yeah. It's a brutal movie too, but wow, it's the kind of captivation you need at this point in time.
And I keep hearing that they may be doing a sequel to it, but I've not heard.
Yeah, apparently there's a series coming out. I have no idea, but that's great stuff. Well, anything to add, Jay, before we sign off here?
No, just that I really appreciate the chance to be on, and it's challenging times for everybody. So having an opportunity to just to talk with somebody outside of my normal circle is a welcome opportunity. So I really appreciate it.
Absolutely. And Champions Day, The End of Old Shanghai is a fascinating book. We have links and more information to additional works and additional images and all the things we talked about in this conversation, as usual, at hourofhistory.com. So thanks, Jay, and thanks everyone for listening to the Hour of History podcast. On the Hour of History, it's our world, anytime, any place. See ya.